From the author of Spinsterella, The Strange and Unusual Romance, and Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black, comes the legendary Magic Children. Pick up the conclusions of the Spinsterella trilogy in paperback and e-readers this Halloween. A couple of months ago, Professor Blacktruth called Negro nerds the coons of the comic book industry when he excoriated the Black Panther teaser trailer. And after seeing some of the behaviors that many of these Negro nerds participate in, I can honestly say that I agree with his observation that Negro nerds are the coons of the comic book industry. Because when it comes down to your Negro nerds, especially when it relates to Marvel Comics and DC Comics, these guys go out of their way to make any excuse to justify whatever these two publishers or any group that's affiliated with them, such as Marvel Studios, produces, and they find ways to make excuses for these people no matter whatever they do. Now, a couple of days ago, I made a video and a blog called Marvel Studios is in Trouble. And I made that blog and video because I had made several observations about their films and the clear decline as it related to quality in their films and the screenwriting and the adaptation of the source material. Now, after I posted that on one of these Facebook groups that features black fantasy and science fiction, the Negro nerds jumped right in to try to defend Marvel Studios. And when they made that defense of Marvel Studios, it wasn't just about expressing a difference of opinion. It was them going out of their way to some of them going into ad hominem attacks and shaming tactics to try to defend Marvel Studios as if they were defending some sort of thing that was of extreme value. Because when it comes down to the Negro nerd and Marvel Comics and DC Comics, it's like watching a slave defending their slave master. And they will go out of their way to make any sort of excuse to say that this slave master has done no wrong to them and that this slave master is the most perfect person in the world. And when I look at the behavior of your Negro nerd, it reminds me very much of the slave on the plantation who is talking about massa's so good to me and I loves me some massa, because they will go out of their way to literally fight to the end to defend Marvel Comics or DC Comics, no matter what type of content they produce. Now, when I look at that Black Panther teaser trailer, I can objectively say that yes, some of the imagery in that film's trailer did appear to be racist. I can agree with Professor Blacktruth on that point, that yes, that plate lip was quite disturbing, those grass skirts were quite disturbing, and some of that other imagery was quite disturbing. But from a screenwriter's perspective, I can look at that film from my almost decade and a half of screenwriting experience and tell you that what was on that screen had some serious issues as related to story. And what was related to story, again, was par for the course with many Marvel Studios films that I've seen, such as Spider-Man Homecoming and many Netflix series like Iron Fist and The Defenders, where I was seeing many of the screenwriting errors that first-year screenwriters make, such as telling instead of showing, running dialogue that goes too long and makes a scene go long, and numerous scenes with exposition where you're again telling me what's happening instead of showing me what's going on. These are first-year screenwriter mistakes, and they were clearly on screen in these Marvel Studios movies, yet the Negro nerd won't call this out because, again, they feel if they call out these white people at Marvel, they're going to get in trouble, and some of them feel that they're not going to get any brownie points with these white people at Marvel. And when they do that, it's really something based in their mind, because this white person that they're trying to get the approval of isn't someone like Tom Beverett or somebody like Axel Alonso who work at Marvel Comics, or even someone who works at Marvel Studios. It's an imaginary white person, because when it comes down to the Negro nerd, they're seeking the validation and approval of an imaginary white person. And they feel if they are critical of something that is owned by whites, that there will be some sort of consequence or repercussion due to it. And that's the way the Negro nerd mind operates. They're looking for validation and approval, and they feel if they like the same things that white people like, that white people will like them and accept them. It's a covert contract that they create with imaginary white people, and then they project onto real white people, and that really prevents them from having an objective view of comic books, science fiction, and fantasy. Because when you don't have an objective view of comic books, science fiction, and fantasy, you're going to go out of your way to try to give passes to products that are far below par. And when I look at Marvel Studios, again, from the perspective of an objective person, the objective of a perspective of a comic fan who's been a collector and a hobbyist for over 30 years, and the perspective of a screenwriter, again, I can honestly say that Marvel Studios is in trouble, because I can look at the quality of their work that is being produced right now and say, yeah, this is not what you were producing back in 2008 when you started the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Quality has clearly slipped at Marvel Studios as it relates to the adaptation of source material, because when you take Peter Parker's story and then transpose it onto Miles Morales, that's a compromise. That is what Warner Brothers used to do back when Joel Schumacher decided he wanted to make a campier, funnier Batman for Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. Because when I look at Spider-Man Homecoming, it reminds me of that decline in quality that Joel Schumacher made, and it also reminds me of the decline in quality when the Salkins made Superman 3, and they decided to add a lot more humor to the Superman stories, and then bring in Richard Pryor for an added comic relief and for diversity. And in both cases, that led to the decline of both the Batman franchise and the Superman franchise. And when I look at what Marvel Studios is doing right now, it's clear to me they're headed in the same direction that Warner Brothers headed in back in the 80s with Superman and back in the 90s with Batman's franchise. They are cutting corners, they are lowering standards, and when you lower standards, you're going to get lower quality. This is why many of their Netflix series have been struggling in terms of quality, and this is why many objective critics will go out of their way to pan something like Iron Fist or Defenders or the back 6 episodes of Luke Cage, or even that Jessica Jones series, which featured the purple straw man who was just there for her to have somebody to easily beat up. They can look at the material from an objective perspective, from a perspective of a screenwriter, from the perspective of a director, and look at it and say, look, this just isn't quality, and it's nowhere near the same level of quality that was produced back in 2008 to 2012 with when you started the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's clearly been a decline in quality, and they can say that because they're observing it based on the criteria of studying film, studying storytelling, and being objective. Unfortunately, the Negro nerd, because they get their self-esteem from white people and white people's products, they're afraid to make that observation, because they see being a Marvel fan or a DC fan as some sort of attachment to get approval from whites. They're afraid to criticize Marvel when they produce products like your Black Panther teaser trailer, which feature racist imagery or feature poor quality storytelling. They're afraid to call out Netflix for producing a Defender series that was absolutely terrible. They're afraid to call out Netflix for making Iron Fist really be terrible. And they're afraid to call out Netflix for making the back 6 episodes of Luke Cage being some of the worst writing I have ever seen in my life. And because they're afraid to call out this type of material, the Negro nerd thinks that he's coming from a position of strength, but he's actually coming from a position of weakness. You don't get respect from people by submitting and deferring to them, because if you submit and defer to people, you are showing them that you have no value in yourself, and you're showing people that they don't have to value you as a person. And with the Negro nerd, he is the person or she is the person who seeks attention and approval from somebody else, and that's giving your power away. And that's what the Negro nerd doesn't understand, because the coon is a person who is somebody who gives away their dignity and their self-respect, their intangibles of manhood and womanhood, all to get the approval of somebody else. And again, they give their power away to others. And this is why people do not respect them. They do not respect them because they do not have the backbone or the character to come out and say what needs to be said, because they fear some sort of imaginary repercussion. The great irony of dealing with Negro nerds is that they often punish other blacks for having a difference of opinion, but they don't have the courage to call out whites who make the same observations. When it comes down to many whites out there who make comic book videos and comic book blogs, they made many of the same observations I made about Iron Fist, Defenders, Spider-Man Homecoming. They often, and the back six of Luke Cage, in saying that these material has clearly declined in quality, but the Negro nerd won't go after those white people. They'll go after a black comic fan like myself and tell us we shouldn't be saying things. We're making blanket statements. We're making generalizations. And again, they come after us because we have the courage to say what needs to be said, because they are afraid if we come out here and say something that's different from the party line that they're establishing, that it's going to upset the white slave masters that are out there at Marvel or DC. And that's not the case at all. When it comes down to people in the comic book world, oftentimes there are differences of opinion. If you go to any message board like the Fwoosh or the former Wizard World or Superhero Hype, there's differences of opinion, and people can agree to disagree. But if you go to a black sci-fi or fantasy or a Facebook group, what's going to happen is if you present an opinion that runs counter to what they want to push as a narrative for black opinions, you're going to get piled on, and in some cases you may even get kicked out. Because on one Facebook group, when I called out Roxane Gay for being hired as just a black feminist writer, I got kicked out of that group because I was trying to explain to people how black feminists are not going to look out for the best interests of black people, and how they haven't looked out for the best interests of black people, and how her hiring is not a positive step towards diversity. And then I got kicked out of that group for standing up for my opinions regarding this Roxane Gay and how her hiring was not a step in the right direction, because to say you're hiring a black feminist writer is not constructive for a character like Black Panther or the world of Wakanda, which was the book that she was a part of, a book that was, again, excoriated by comic fans, had poor sales, and was quickly canceled. And the reason why it was quickly canceled was for many of the reasons I described in my blog, where I said that this writer was not a good fit for the character, she was not a good fit for the stories, and she pushed a narrative in her comics that really did not fit the character. Unfortunately, when it comes down to your Negro nerd, they do not want to hear differences of opinion, different viewpoints, different ideas, and they only want you to toe the party line as it relates to these characters at Marvel and DC. And they feel if you come out and present a difference of opinion regarding these characters at these big companies, they're not going to be able to get any brownie points from the white people they seek approval of. And that's, again, a really sad way to live, because you're not enjoying comics because you love comic books. You're not enjoying these characters because you like these characters. You're not reading these stories because you like these stories. Really, you're only into comics because you want to get a covert contract to get approval and attention from white people, and that's not what the hobby is about. The hobby is about enjoying the characters and the stories, and if a story is not up to par, you should be able to say that story is not up to par. If there's media and imagery that is racist, yes, we need to call it out. And that's part of being a comic fan. It's like you have to be able to say what you need to say and not be forced to toe some sort of party line or fear some sort of repercussion, all because you present a difference of opinion, a different viewpoint, and a different idea of things. When I make my observations about Marvel Studios, again, I'm coming from the perspective of a novelist who has written numerous fantasy titles, a screenwriter who has written screenplays, and a comic fan, but I also bring in some objectivity as related to those mediums, and I can come in with my experience and expertise and just tell you when something is wrong, because I know when there's something wrong in a story. I know when a scene is going too long. I know when a writer is taking too long to set up. I have that experience because I've written over 50 books. I've written numerous fantasy stories and screenplays, and I know when something is going wrong. And I can look at Marvel Studios and I can honestly critique them because I see something wrong. And because I see something wrong, I'm going to talk about it because, again, I care about the comic book industry. I care about the fantasy industry. And the way Marvel is going is not a good direction, because if their Marvel Studios goes out, it's not going to be good for many comic fans, because what happens is, if things start to fall, what happens is the studios are like this. The studios, if something doesn't make money for a while, they're going to stop making it, and that's just going to be the end of it for a good long time. And if the whole thing is with the studios, they need to see money coming in, and if you're continuously producing poor quality product, what happens is the customers start to walk away. And the Negro nerds, they're so spellbound and caught up in this whole idea of that a Black Panther movie is going to be this thing that leads to this gateway to more superhero movies. They're not looking at the big picture as a guy like I have, who has been studying the entertainment business for over 20 years. I can tell you honestly, if they have one bad movie, there's not going to be any more movies. And if they have produced a trailer that's not really up to par, then what's going to happen is, yeah, you'll get people coming in for the first week of a Black Panther movie, but what's going to happen is it's going to have that 50 to 75% drop, and the studio executive is going to come in and say, look, these movies aren't performing up to speed. We're looking at these numbers as it relates to these other superhero movies that have not really been performing as strongly. And the whole idea of this black superhero movie, we're not going to make any more movies. And sometimes even when a film does well, like Blade made, which really revived the comic book film genre, they don't go out here and make other black movies. So that whole covert contract that many Negro nerds have, it's really scary. But the whole Negro nerd being a coon, that's something, again, I'm seeing more and more of, and it's really sad, again, to see, because, again, if you're into this hobby, you should be in this hobby because you love the characters, you love the material, and not to try to get some brownie points with white people. Comic collecting is not about getting points with white folks. It's not about getting approval from white folks. And yes, you are allowed to have your own opinion, and it's not about becoming some sort of monolith and having some sort of monolithic thought where everybody has to go and stand in line, being a buffer that goes out of its way to defend Marvel and DC and the comic book industry from any sort of fault or some way of not being held accountable when they make some sort of mistake or they produce some product that's just not up to par. If you'd like to see me make more videos, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. If you want to try some of my SJS Direct Fantasy titles, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.